Well, good morning, everyone. It's 11 o'clock here in London, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's FS Club webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about what do Schrems 2, Brexit, and data localization rules mean for cross-border data compliance and your global digital strategy. And with a snappy title like that, we have to have at least two presenters. So we have today Samita Patel and Gordon Ardell, who are going to be talking us through it. Now, you'll know me, I'm Michael Mainelli, I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it really is my delight to be able to introduce so many of these webinars along with my other hosts on these. And the reason is, frankly, we've got such a great group of sponsors, a whole variety of sponsors here who are very kind and allow us to range widely across technology, economics, and finance. And of course, today's session is a very, very important one in that regard. Schrems 1 came out, and it was a very interesting thing. Then it's named after Maximilian Schrems, an Austrian privacy advocate. And Schrems 2, which was somewhat unexpected, popped out this past July. But it's not for me to explain, it's for our guests. Just to walk you through, as ever, the agenda today. I'm going to get out of your way as quickly as possible so you can hear from Samita and Gordon. Please do remember that we have a question and answer session after their presentation of approximately 25 minutes. And to get comments, questions, or observations into that, please use the GoToWebinar question facility on your screen. A lot of people like to email me or text me. That's very kind, but I'm here with you right now, so I'll only get those afterwards. And so please do send them through to me, and I will be feeding them into the conversation. And it should be a particularly rich conversation because I think that we've all been, to some degree, overwhelmed at the lack of progress on Brexit. We tend to forget that there's some real changes ahead, and this is potentially one of the most important ones for anybody working in technology and finance. Well, enough of me, if I may, and our two presenters are going to get cracking. And I was just wondering if I could hand the floor over to you, Samita.
Of course, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. My name is Samita Patel, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you all today. I suppose a little bit of background for me. I've spent the best part of about 10 years specialising in privacy and data protection, really helping organisations design and deliver global privacy programmes. And as you can probably imagine, more recently, due to recent developments in this space, this support has had a particular focus on the data transfer work streams of those global privacy programmes, which you may have guessed is the focus of the session today. I will hand over to Gordon, who will quickly introduce himself before we move on to discussing what we're going to cover today. Gordon.
Many thanks, Samita and Michael, and many thanks, Zien, for the invitation. I am a barrister. I practice in London and when such things are allowed, despite quarantine restrictions in Brussels. Barristers are probably best known for ripping everything to shreds when projects fall over. But just occasionally, we play a more positive role, and we advise our clients on how best to avoid things falling over in the first place. And I've acted for many years in the privacy space, dealing sometimes with commercial claims for breach of confidence, sometimes with the regulatory end of things, GDPR and other European privacy issues. And I have a broad practice acting for data controllers, sure, but also sometimes for NGOs, individuals, data protection authorities, DPAs themselves, and other people with an interest. So I hope to bring a broad perspective to today's discussion. So back to Samita.
Thanks very much. So I thought I might spend a couple of minutes just really talking about what we're going to cover into today's session. Firstly, as you can see, the headline of Schrems 2 and what impact this has had on risk to organisations. We also thought it might be useful to provide a bit of a practical overview, which Gordon will walk you through, of dealing with competing regulatory requirements, as sometimes this might not be contemplated or could even be overlooked. We'll then touch on Brexit and how the end of transition is shaping up. followed by what we hope is a really practical discussion around managing and approaching cross-border data transfer projects within organisations. We'll then recap the key takeaways from today's session and hand over to you all for Q&A. As you can all see, there's a very good amount of content to cover. So on that note, let's dive straight in. So this slide is a very, very sort of high-level overview of where data localization or data requirements, data transfer requirements, plot across the globe. It's by no means intended to be a comprehensive overview of those data localization and data transfer requirements. However, you can see that there are pockets of these requirements that pop up across the entire, span the entire globe. Just to recap then, some of those requirements are data specific. So that's talking about particular kinds of data types that cannot be transferred cross-border from a particular jurisdiction. And then some of them are also sector specific. So we're talking about public sector, government organisations, or healthcare sectors. So, many of you will have various localization requirements or data transfer requirements applicable to your organisation. So this is just an overview to set the scene. I suppose some notable developments in this area have been, we've seen some newer sort of requirements being introduced in the likes of China, India. The EU have recently published the Data Governance Act, which is creating a framework really with generated data from EU citizens to help businesses and public bodies to share data more freely, but really in keeping with the EU requirements. So that's the Data Governance Act. And as the magnifying glass sort of indicates here, we'll be focusing on the EU and the UK for the rest of this session. I suppose it's really important to understand that there are some countries and some requirements that restrict the transfer of data across border, but there are some that just impose additional safeguards, such as the EU, that don't necessarily talk about localization of that particular data set, but just impose additional requirements for you to transfer that data so it's safeguarded in light of the local requirements. So I suppose before we move on, we thought it might be interesting to run a quick poll on which regional requirements your organisations are most concerned about. So if you do, take a couple of minutes to answer the poll, and the results will be with us very shortly.
Yeah, so I don't think it'll take a couple of minutes, Samita. We've got an audience that's pretty fast off the mark here.
Excellent.
Just bear with me a second. Over half the folks have voted. And just give it another
very speedy.
4 or 5 seconds. There we go. That's it. I'll close the poll now, and that's just about everybody. So fantastic. And here are the results. An overwhelming percentage, 92%, believe it's the EEA and the EU, but they can vote on multiples. So 55% for North America is next, Middle East and Africa, Asia Pacific, and then Middle East and Africa, and then finally Latin America. So any quick comment on that?
No, I think it's great to see that the content of our session is focused on the area that is most concerning to all. So handing over to Gordon now.
My thoughts precisely. We're clearly on the right track with this seminar. So many thanks for that, everyone. Well, Schrems, it's a headline. Here are some of the choicer headlines from the mainstream and sectoral media. And Schrems is a headline issue because it comes at a time when it creates a perfect storm when cross-read to Brexit, because what the UK wants and what the UK needs from the Brexit process is an adequacy decision from the EU. It needs its equivalent of safe harbour, although it needs an equivalent of safe harbour that's going to fare a little better in the event of a challenge in the European Court of Justice. That's not up for negotiation. It's not part of the negotiations. It's a unilateral matter for the Commission. But of course, that process is freighted with all the ill-tempered politics that we've seen on display over the last few days in the Brexit negotiations themselves. So Schrems is a big deal, partly for that reason. But actually, and if we could have the next slide, please, for avid watchers of this space, it shouldn't really be such a big surprise after all, because Schrems, I think, is best seen as the latest in a long line of landmarks, pieces of legislation, but particularly cases decided by the European Court of Justice, which have gradually strengthened the standards of protection of individual rights in the data privacy space. So no surprises really, and you can see on the screen some of the landmark events and decisions. But the real takeaway from this is that Schrems is the latest in a long line of cases which have gradually developed a set of principles that govern the way in which data controllers and public authorities have to respect people's data privacy, people's data autonomy. It's a very complex body of law, but let me try and reduce it to this. Basically, what the court has said over the years, and it said the same thing in Schrems, is that any rules that authorize an interference with personal privacy have to be clear, they have to be transparent, and they have to be proportionate. And that translates into three principles, three ideas. First of all, courts don't like mass or blanket intrusion into personal data. You have to have a good reason for interfering with someone's data rights. You have to target your data intrusion measures. Secondly, this is probably the most important of the principles in terms of what we're going to be looking at today. The rules and policies that authorize the processing or handling of people's private information have to be clear to the data subject. Some of the biggest headline fines from data protection authorities just recently, I don't know if anyone spotted this, I think the other week there was something on the wires about a large French supermarket that received a fine for 3 million euros. By far and away, the biggest element of the fine in the reasoning of the French Data Protection Authority was for failing to provide transparent information on the website as to how data was going to be used and transferred. So policies have to be clear. That's what transparency is about. And then finally, safeguards have to be adequate. And in particular, what the courts insist on is effective redress for individuals who complain that their data has been mistreated. And those three principles added together are what the European Court calls the high level of protection guaranteed under EU law for personal data. And developments in the specific area of overseas transfer of data were catapulted into judicial attention by the Snowden revelations all those years ago, where it was key that the US authorities were doing exactly what the European Court says you mustn't do. They were accessing huge amounts of data without any individual justification for looking at particular people's data. They were doing it covertly, so there was no transparency, and there were no routes by which non-US citizens whose data was being swallowed up by prison and so forth could obtain any redress. So that's the background to Schrems. If we can look quickly at the next slide. In a sense, I've given you the content. What Schrems decided was precisely what I've just summarized about the inadequacy of the US system. And of course, it had already decided very much the same point in Schrems 1. It invalidated the original safe harbor adequacy decision, and effectively it said that the privacy shield, the substitute adequacy decision based on supposed patching up of the deficiencies in the US system, it said that really didn't fit the bill. And the key principles were, here we are on the slide. If you're going to transfer data out of the EU or EEA, you've got to rely on one of those three routes under Chapter 5 of the GDPR, an adequacy decision, or if you haven't got that, standard contractual clauses or similar, or derogations under Article 49. For each of those routes, the same high level of protection applies, those principles that I quickly looked at earlier. And the high standards that are required are the same for each of the routes. So whether you're relying on an adequacy decision or standard contractual clauses, those same principles of protection of people's data have to be observed. Now, the real challenge in Schrems was actually not to Privacy Shield at all. It was to the standard contractual clauses that are authorised by another Commission decision. It was a frontal attack on those. The frontal attack sort of failed. Why did it sort of fail? Well, the court ruled that the standard contractual clauses were valid, but that came at a price. They were only valid because the data controller has an obligation to verify that they're actually working, has to verify that the data are in fact being processed in accordance with that essentially equivalent standard of protection in the recipient territory. The recipient of the data under those standard clauses is under an obligation to monitor that, and in turn the data controller in the EU is under an obligation to monitor that things are actually working, that the recipient is doing what they should. And if not, says the Court of Justice, the data controller has to suspend or end the data flow. And if the data controller doesn't do it, then the National Data Protection Authority is under an obligation to step in. So the SSCs are valid, but that validity comes at a price. However, the Privacy Shield decision, which actually wasn't what was fundamentally under attack in this case, was ruled invalid. So the same problems which the court identified in Schrems 1 hadn't been rectified. So on to the next slide, please. So what's the fallout from Schrems 2? Well, I think it can be summarized in one word, and that is risk, possibly two words: outsourcing of risk. You can no longer rely on Privacy Shield. The vocabulary of shield was well chosen. It's the idea that a shield is created by the EU and US authorities. They've negotiated among themselves, and you, the data controller, can rely unquestionably on the adequacy decision for transferring your data. That ends here. The point about standard contractual clauses, certainly as interpreted by the courts, is that the data controller now bears the onus of ensuring that the system works. The data controller can't rely on the assumption that standard contractual clauses are doing their job. The data controller has to monitor that. So risk has been outsourced to data controllers, and so has the risk of something going wrong. And the risk is twofold, the double whammy, as I've called it. First of all, at a regulatory level, following the GDPR, the National Data Protection Authorities now have real teeth. They can impose fines of a very significant proportion of turnover. And that's coupled with new rights for data subjects in the courts. The scope for individual court claims against data controllers by individual data subjects has been increased. So there's also a risk that data controllers who get this wrong are going to be subject to actions for damages. And the prospect of that has gradually been creeping up. Why? Because of the parallel growth of group and class actions in the consumer protection space in the EU and in the UK. That's important. Individual claims for misuse of data, claims by data subjects against data controllers, can be costly if they're brought by individuals, and they don't tend to produce very large awards in damages. The point about group and class claims is that, first of all, you aggregate the damages, but secondly, and more importantly, you pool the costs, and that makes these kind of claims very attractive to funders. Funders are getting interested precisely because the aggregate of a large number of modest claims can be a very large figure indeed, and so the funder steps in to fund the pooled cost. So the risk is being transferred, and the scope of the risk, the price that can be paid if something goes wrong, that's risen as well. So how do you manage the risk? Well, here comes a case study. As Samita mentioned earlier, we've chosen the case study, this problem of competing regulatory requirements. Why? Because this is a very good example of the risk, the onus being on the data controller, but it's also an example of how a data controller can take practical steps to manage and mitigate that risk. Now, as I said, what the court said in Schrems 2 was that whichever route you take, whether it's the derogations under Article 49 or an adequacy decision or standard contractual clauses, the same high level of protection applies. If you're transferring data to the law enforcement authorities of the third country, actually you've never been able to rely on SCCs. You've always had to rely on the derogations. And what the court has affirmed in Schrems is that even with those derogations, you've still got to apply safeguards that apply those principles of transparency and proportionality, essentially equivalent. Now, here's where you have a problem, because if you're transferring data, for example, to the US Treasury in relation to a tax or a sanctions investigation, The US Treasury want it all. If you say, as a financial services operator, terribly sorry, you can't have it, you're not going to get a very friendly response from OFAC or the US Treasury. They're going to say, well, terribly sorry, we want this, and as you know, we can make life difficult for you if in dollar trading if we don't get it. At the same time, if you do hand over all the information about your customers and their counterparties, which OFAC is asking for, you're going to be in deep water with your National Data Protection Authority. It's actually very difficult, if not impossible, to be entirely compliant with both the requirements that OFAC impose and the requirements that your National Data Controller is going to impose post-Schrems under the GDPR. So what you're aiming for in practical terms is a system for data exports, which is, as I've called it, maximally compliant. No pun with maximally and Schrems intended. Okay, the pun was intended, and I know it's terrible, so brickbats rather than bouquets. So how do you deal with that? Well, my suggestion is this, that you focus on the second of those three principles, the one I said is possibly the most important. That is transparency, ensuring that you've told everyone, not just data subjects, but your National Data Protection Authority, how you're going to comply, how you're going to take rights into account. And what's important is audit trails, not just in terms of how you've set up your decision-making structure, explaining where the decision points are going to be, explaining how your staff are going to balance the demands from the US Treasury against the requirements of data protection, but also when you're dealing with an individual request about individual data subjects information, keeping an audit trail, showing how you struck the balance, showing how you've decided whether the balance favors passing on that information. So audit trails at the macro and micro level are the key to transparency, and that's how you're going to mitigate those risks. So even if you can't eliminate the risk entirely, and you're caught out by the Data Protection Authority or by an individual claim, you're going to have a good story to tell about mitigating fines and mitigating liability to damages. So it's about understanding and then taking practical steps to mitigate risk. So back to Samita. I'm so sorry, a quickie on Brexit on the next slide, if I may. I think I've said what I'm going to say about Brexit, so it's just the last point here. And it's this, the point about Brexit is that if we don't get an adequacy decision by the 31st of December, and I have to say it's looking iffy, then you're going to have to fall back on standard contractual clauses if you're receiving data flows from a data controller in the EEA. And that means the boot's on the other foot. You're going to be in the position of the people who are formerly the US data processors receiving data flows from you. So in Schrems terms, you're going to be the position of Facebook US was in relation to Facebook Ireland. And that means you're the one that's going to have to be monitoring the operation of the standard contractual clauses you've signed up to. And if you don't provide information in real time to the data controller who's exporting the data to you, persuading them that things are all working properly and that your data is not being swallowed up wholesale by the UK defence and law enforcement authorities, then the data flow to you is going to be stopped. So again, that's how the onus is going to work post-Brexit unless and until we get an adequacy decision. So that's the short Brexit point. And now it is over to Samita. Thanks.
Thank you, Gordon. So we have another poll. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about some of the risks that Gordon has outlined, and how to manage them actually. But before we move on, we wanted to do a very quick pulse check so that we can all understand whether we've started working on cross-border data transfer projects or not. So take a couple of seconds to answer this poll, and we'll see the results very shortly. Oh, Michael, I think you might be on mute.
Thank you very much, Samita. Yes, just closing the poll there. Over 3/4 have voted. And what you can see here is an overwhelming majority of people have commenced projects around managing cross-border data and transfer risks. So there we go.
Excellent.
And I'll hand back to you.
Excellent, thank you. So, from the results of the poll, it's interesting to see that, the large majority of you are aware of projects that have started to manage this risk. A proportion of you have not yet or are unaware of any cross-border data transfer projects that are happening within your respective organisations. For those of you who are midway through those projects or currently, starting to embark on them, we thought it might be worth setting out at a very, very high level the typical steps or phases that we've seen organisations consider. These phases also, it's important to note, really map or align to the European Data Protection Board's guidance. So that was released last month, I think about the 9th or 10th of November. And it was basically setting out supplementary measures to ensure that the same level of protection is afforded when EU data is transferred cross-border. And it also set out some essential guarantees. So when you are looking at the laws or the interference that could happen to the EU data of the country that you are transferring to, the essential guarantees that you may require from that particular jurisdiction to again safeguard the data when it's being transferred. So you'll find that if you are familiar with the EDPB guidance, that these steps or these phases largely map back to or consider the EDPB guidance recommendations and the steps that they recommend also. It's good to note that whilst we're focusing on the EU and whilst I've referenced the European Data Protection Board and we're looking at Schrems as a topic, this methodology, I'd like to say, it applies to other forms of data localization. So we've helped organisations, adopt this sort of methodology to address particular data transfer or localization rules as well. So, some of the sub-activities or points may be different, but it doesn't only just focus on addressing EU requirements. So just to touch on each phase in turn. So starting with evaluate. Oh, apologies, Michael. If we go back, I'm just going to touch on each phase in turn. Evaluate. So this is about knowing your transfers. Easier said than done, of course, but I'd like to mention that here we've seen organisations sort of leverage existing records of processing activities, systems architecture diagrams and asset inventories to help them actually map their data transfers, to understand where data is going across their organisations. So there are things that may exist within your organisations that you can leverage to help you do that. Some organisations are also looking at tools, so more from the technical aspect, e-discovery or other data mapping tools or solutions that help them do that. But otherwise, they are using, their existing system architecture and records of processing activities as a starting point. What we're also seeing people do in this evaluate phase is to start to address or tier those transfers, to prioritise those transfers that most concern you. So we saw that at the beginning of the session, the poll indicated that you were most, this audience particularly, was most concerned about EU, US and Asia Pac. So that could help you with your tiering. So are you looking at EU data being transferred to the US? That could be tier 1, EU to elsewhere in the world, that could be tier 2, and so on. So this is really, you're not trying to boil the ocean here. It will also help you to prioritize what transfers you're going to start to remedy first, or what are most concerning you. We can also think about, we can also sort of lose sight of the external vendors sometimes that we use and the onward transfers. So remember that when you're mapping and understanding those data transfers, you're looking at internal transfers, your internal IT systems, the data that you process as an internally as an organisation. If you are providing services or technology solutions, hosting solutions on behalf of customers, you're looking at that data as well, and also some of the vendors and sub-processors or sub-vendors that you use, so those onward transfers. Moving on to respond, this is about, oh, I'm sorry, Michael, if we stay on the previous slide, that's okay, no worries. Moving on to respond, this is where you're reviewing the controls that you already have in place. So you've mapped your transfers, you're now reviewing to see what safeguards you have in place already, whether it be contractual or other safeguards that you have in place to legitimise those transfers. Here we would say also document the risk related to those particular movements of data. So drawing back to the EDPB guidance, you're also assessing here, part of that assessment of risk is assessing the laws of the country that you're transferring to. And the EDPB actually puts in some suggestions in their guidance about the essential guarantees. I won't go into too much detail, but that's essentially considering anything in the law or practice of that third country that may impinge on the effectiveness of that safeguard or transfer. So you're looking at what's already in place and you're documenting the risk according to the transfers that you've mapped and evaluate. Moving on to remedy, here's where you start implementing. So you're implementing things from a technical, organisational and contractual perspective. Again, the EDPB has released some guidance that sets out some suggested, recommendations across all of those three, the technical, organisational and contractual recommendations. But also it's important here that going back to Gordon's point, it's important for you to be documenting what steps you're actually taking to mitigate that risk. We found that this has been a really important step, not only to external parties, but also to senior leadership, to the board, to show how you are documenting your progress for these particular projects and how you are moving the compliance dial or mitigating the risk that you're trying to address. Moving on then very quickly to manage. This, I suppose, is where some of the organisational measures sort of fall. This is about updating your policies, procedures, inserting the checkpoints within particular procurement, vendor management, privacy impact assessment policies. So you are addressing your immediate risks, but you're also planning for the future. So don't forget about, the projects that you have upcoming, some of those, the data lake initiatives we see so many organisations working on at the moment, whether it be offshoring, outsourcing projects that you have that might not be in flight, but that your organisation is developing, inserting those checkpoints and inputting to the planning of those processes, which is all going to, impacts on these rules and some of the decisions that you take. So moving then on to the next slide. Lots of people have asked, what does a transfer impact assessment look like? What are the key components? What are we supposed to be, assessing? So we inserted this slide to help sort of put that into practice, I suppose. So when you're looking at the previous phases of respond and remedy, and you're documenting risks and you're trying to understand or tier and group your data transfers, it's really important to understand the categories of data, the volume and sensitivity. So that will give you already a very good indication of whether that has a certain level of risk and will help you tier. those transfers that you would most likely address first. We're then looking at, and what I mentioned before, is the data importer legal landscape. So that the laws of that third country, is there anything in those laws that impinge on the safeguards that you have in place, that could cause some level of interference with the data that is being transferred. So you're also trying to assess that. You're looking at your external data sharing protocols. So that is more of the organizational methods, the contractual methods that you have in place, and your policies and the contractual terms that you have in place to support those transfers. And then from more of a technical aspect, the data security safeguards. So these elements, very practically speaking, these elements could be something that you look to insert or enhance any existing privacy by design policies or protocols to make sure that you're actually inserting or gathering the information and assessing the level of risk that allows you to not only understand the risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals, as we do with many data protection impact assessments, but also bolstering those processes so that you're also assessing the level of transfer risk. So we can cover any questions that you have on that in the Q&A. But moving then on to key takeaways from this session, I think that it was been interesting to see that many of you have commenced your projects so far. But what we are seeing organisations do is develop and maintain very prioritised plans for mitigating risk, and also bolstering that with ongoing protocols and monitoring. So this is not a one-time exercise. You may address your data transfers and mitigate the risk, the immediate risk, but what the regulators and organisations are doing and suggesting is that you revisit that on a periodic basis to understand whether that risk has changed. So don't forget about that ongoing sort of monitoring as well. So develop a prioritised plan and ongoing protocols and monitoring to manage risk. Go ahead, Michael.
We've got a lot of questions here, so I wonder if you just pile into them, if that's all right.
Of course.
Chiara Stici was wondering, Gordon, if you wouldn't mind providing the exact reference to the new EU collective redress rules that you mentioned.
I can do that, but I'm going to. That will involve a lot of sort of neurotic looking of things up. But the EU collective redress directive is basically it's aimed at a whole series of areas of what might be broadly called consumer protection, including GDPR. I'll provide the reference if I may, if I get an opportunity while other questions are being dealt with, but I don't want to try and take up time.
That's great. And we can post that on the site or in the chat room. Got a question here as well from Bob McDowell. Does data transfer apply to files, laptops, memory sticks, and others physically taken out of the relevant regulatory jurisdiction?
Yes, it certainly does. Hence civil servants getting into deep water when they leave laptops and so on trains.
Okay. Gary Glennon-Alty is curious, does the liability for misuse of data include the creation of misinformation associated with personal information?
It can, because one of the important data subject rights is a right to correct incorrect or misleading data. So it segues into that space.
Good. And another question for you from Ian Sheridan. Gordon, the EU's EDPB fills in the gaps in the GDPR's case law and provides guidance on global DP issues. From the 1st of January, will the ICO fulfill a similar role with future UK Supreme Court decisions and guidance, or is that unknown?
I think that's the idea, essentially. One of the big problems with repatriating EU regulation following Brexit, not just in data protection, but across the piece, is understanding whether the new mechanisms for supervision of what the UK government's up to are going to be as effective and as powerful as the equivalent EU mechanisms. I think that largely remains to be seen.
Okay. From Scott Bryan, I think this might be for you, Samita. I use a hosting service for my website. Like most, it is under constant attack by bots. While I am able to deal with this, it is obvious that just a handful of sources are responsible for the attacks. Since these are obvious, what is the legal liability of the national and international agencies that allow these to operate, both as originators of this activity or targets of it, especially with regards to situations where one gets access to data when they should not have been allowed to operate? And do the
None.
regulatory
Yeah,
agencies
the answer
carry
is
any
none.
liability?
Tough luck. It's very, very difficult to impose duties of care on national regulatory authorities. Courts, not just in the UK jurisdictions, but throughout Europe, are very reluctant to say that, to police the particular way in which regulatory authorities go about this kind of enforcement work. If a national regulatory authority said, we're just not interested, we're going to do nothing, that could be reviewed as a statement of policy. But courts aren't going to get into the minutiae of saying, well, you should have done this and you didn't act quite effectively enough. So I'm afraid it's another of those stories where the buck stops with the data controller.
Where enterprises have bought data from end users, do data protection regulations last? That was from Bob McDowell.
That's a tricky one. They might, but essentially the safest assumption is if you're doing anything with EU and UK citizens' data, regardless of the source, you're going to be a data controller and you're going to be subject to regulation.
Yeah, so I would wholeheartedly agree with that. We've seen organisations treat bought-in data from data subjects or with their permission in the same way as any other data. So the same rules are being applied.
Okay. Gary asks, do you think organizations may choose to transfer risk to the individual by insisting that the individual assume responsibility for their data? Which, of course, this is me speaking personally, is subject to a report we did last year on information rules and new data architectures, rather than run the risk of processing personal data in a non-compliant fashion. Samita, any thoughts?
I'm sorry, Michael. Could you repeat that question?
Sure.
I'm awfully sorry.
Do you think organizations may choose to transfer risk to the individual by insisting that the individual assume responsibility for their data rather than run the risk of processing it in a non-compliant fashion?
I don't think so. That's just my personal opinion. I don't think that they may wish to look at something like consent or something, but that's not what I have been discussing with many large organisations. I think that they're still maintaining the responsibility, and in fact, some of them are actually saying that they are going to compensate individuals. So they're retaining that liability and they're going to compensate individuals if they are found to be in breach of rules.
Okay. From Bob again, does data protection have an historical limitation, i.e. if data is more than X years old, is it exempt from regulatory requirements?
On the contrary, under the GDPR, data subjects have a right to be forgotten. So if you're holding on to old data, then you won't get a tick for doing so. So having a data destruction policy and publishing it is one of the key planks of ensuring that you're compliant in terms of data subject rights.
Chiara would like you to answer, Gordon. Just could you expand just a teensy bit on the issue of the appointment of a representative under GDPR?
Can I take the rain check on that one, because it would involve a longer answer than I think most people would want. Again, let's pick that one up off grid.
Also related to that, but maybe you could. Any thoughts on? And Chiara, in fact, ran a webinar on this on Article 40 Code of Conducts and what role they might play in this.
That's interesting. That's been under consideration, and my take on this is that codes of conduct are very helpful and very useful. And I think the thinking. Let's look at what's going to happen after the parting of the ways at the end of transition. English courts, in particular, like codes of conduct, but they like holding organisations to code of conduct. So there's always a benefit and a burden with this. If you're saying, well, there's a code of conduct and we're sticking to it and we get a tick for doing so, the flip side of that is if you don't stick to it, then that can be a further ground on which you can find yourselves open to criticism. So they're useful, but there's a bit of a price tag to them.
Chiara continues, transparency is a good start, but the individual redress element is never in the control of the data sender or controller. Being transparent about sending data to China but having no control over the individual redress is not going to cut much ice with the EU data protection supervisory authorities. Isn't this a theoretical exercise? The risk is there and cannot be minimized.
What you're doing is telling your data subjects what the risk is to which their data is being subject. So informed consent is one of the idea of autonomy of the data subject is one of the leitmotifs of the thinking of the Court of Justice and the European Parliament and others with an interest in this. And so it may be that there are certain risks to which the consumer is subjecting themselves, but they've got to know about it. And so transparency is the watchword. As I say, when I was giving the example of conflicting requirements, you may not be able to be entirely compliant, but you can make yourself maximally compliant. And one of the ways you can help do that, mitigate the risk, is by telling people what you're doing.
And also, just to add to that, documenting those decisions that you've actually taken a proper approach to evaluate what the risks are with the China data protection laws or surveillance laws.
Okay. It's always a sign that we're coming to the end of time when people begin thanking, and I will in fact be passing all the comments and questions on to both Samita and Gordon. But I might like to end on just a somewhat discursive point, even though the time is short. And basically, according to Oliver Patel, it seems as if you interpret Schrems 2 in the EDP guidance literally, many EU, EES, US data transfers have to stop. And I might add to that, as I was watching this presentation, I was thinking if I was a UK processing center in the middle of a whole bunch of EU, particularly financial services work, I could see that many of my clients might want to bypass me. Do you think this will actually happen?
My take on this, for what it's worth, is that it's a reminder that among all the burdens that this strand of legislation imposes on business, there's also an opportunity. And it's an opportunity that's not been lost on the EU institutions. They rather like the idea of developing a European cloud. And the Commission, there was a Commission press release just last month on the development of an EU cloud as part of that package of measures that Samita referred to right at the beginning. So for those who are interested in investing in this space, I think there's an opportunity here in terms of making Europe competitive with the US and with China as a place where data is processed and used.
Exactly, and I mentioned also the EU Data Governance Act is on the same is doing exactly that.
Great. Well, wow, what a subject to roll through. And you'd have thought some arcane area of the law wouldn't provoke so many wonderful questions. If I may, I just have 3 quick rounds of thanks. The first, as ever, are to the sponsors who make all of this possible. Many of you are working deep in the area of, anything to do with technology is deep in the area of data, and personal data is a crucial part of that. So thank you very much for allowing us to run a session on this. I'd like to thank the audience. You've been extremely vigorous and active today, and we do love it. It means that we're obviously hitting some nerves that are worth touching on. We do have a wealth of webinars coming forward this week alone. We'll be looking at AML tomorrow, on Wednesday, which is of course quite related to this, and a whole bunch of other things on the website. But obviously the people I really want to thank are both Samita and Gordon for preparing today. Unfortunately, in this age of COVID, I'm unable to open the floodgates of applause that the audience would give you. But as I said, I shall pass on their comments. But I do, in fact, I brought my little Korean karmic clapper here from my temple in Bukoksa, and I thank you on behalf of the audience.
Big thanks to you.
I think it's an area we're going to have to keep a really close eye on, and perhaps we can have you back next year to update us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Many thanks.